The Lungu family ruled Zambia's political headlines for years. Scandals, power struggles, and a legacy that divided the nation. But now, the page has turned. What comes next for Zambia? Who will rise? Who will fall? And how will this new chapter shape the country's future and Africa's place on the world stage? Today, we go inside the secrets, the rivalries, and the unexpected alliances that could decide Zambia's destiny. Zambia's politics has entered a new era. The Lungu family era has ended, but the drama is far from over. From the court battles and exile stories to President Hakainde Hichilema's next moves, we uncover what's really happening behind closed doors. In this documentary-style breakdown, we explore how the Lungu family's legacy still shapes Zambia's politics, the rising political figures who could redefine the nation, the global powers quietly influencing Zambia's future, what this means for ordinary Zambians and Africa as a whole. This is the untold story of Zambia's next chapter, and it's bigger than politics. Subscribe for more African political documentaries and breaking news. Nation turns the page. Zambia, a landlocked country in southern Africa, has long been a beacon of relative political stability in a region often marked by turmoil. Since gaining independence from Britain in 1964, Zambia has navigated its share of challenges, including economic fluctuations tied to its copper-dependent economy, governance issues, and periodic political tensions. The metaphor of turning the page encapsulates a pivotal moment in Zambia's history, particularly following the 2021 presidential election, which saw the end of Edgar Lungu's presidency and the rise of Hakainde Hichilema, leader of the United Party for National Development (UPND). This transition marked a significant shift not only in leadership but also in the political narrative of a nation seeking to redefine its trajectory amid domestic and global pressures. The question of whether Zambia is truly turning the page hinges on several factors: the legacy of the Lungu administration, the ability of Hichilema's government to deliver on promises of reform, and the broader socio-economic context. Zambia's political history has been shaped by a series of charismatic leaders, from Kenneth Kaunda, the country's first president, to more recent figures like Michael Sata and Edgar Lungu. Each leader has left an imprint on the nation's governance, economy, and social fabric. The 2021 election, however, was a watershed moment, driven by widespread dissatisfaction with Lungu's leadership, economic mismanagement, and allegations of democratic backsliding. Hichilema's victory, with 59% of the vote, signaled a public demand for change, but the question remains whether this shift represents a new chapter or merely a continuation of cyclical political patterns. Zambia's challenges are multifaceted. The country faces a daunting debt crisis, with external debt reaching $14.5 billion by 2020, much of it owed to Chinese creditors. Inflation, unemployment, and poverty rates remain high, with over 54% of Zambians living below the poverty line. The copper industry, which accounts for over 70% of export earnings, is vulnerable to global price fluctuations, adding to economic instability. Politically, Zambia has maintained a democratic framework, but concerns about electoral integrity, media freedom, and judicial independence have persisted, particularly under Lungu's rule. Hichilema's administration has promised to address these issues, but the path forward is fraught with challenges, including managing public expectations, navigating global economic pressures, and consolidating power in a polarized political landscape. The notion of turning the page also reflects Zambia's aspirations for a more inclusive, prosperous, and democratic future. Hichilema's campaign centered on promises of economic recovery, anti-corruption measures, and restoring democratic norms. However, the transition is not without risks. Political divisions remain deep, with Lungu's Patriotic Front (PF) retaining significant support in certain regions, particularly in the Copperbelt and Lusaka. Moreover, external influences, including China's growing presence and Western interests in Zambia's minerals, complicate the country's ability to chart an independent course. Thus, the question of whether Zambia is truly turning the page depends on how effectively Hichilema's government can address these challenges while fulfilling the aspirations of a population eager for change. The Lungu family's political rise and fall. Edgar Chagwa Lungu's political journey is a quintessential story of ascent, consolidation, and eventual decline, emblematic of Zambia's dynamic political landscape. Lungu, a lawyer by training, rose from relative obscurity to become Zambia's sixth president, serving from 2015 to 2021. His rise was closely tied to the Patriotic Front (PF), founded by Michael Sata, whose populist appeal and focus on the urban poor resonated with many Zambians. Lungu's trajectory, however, was not just a personal story, but one intertwined with his family's influence, particularly his wife, Esther Lungu, and their broader political network. Rise to power. Lungu's ascent began after Sata's death in 2014. As a trusted ally of Sata, Lungu served in various ministerial roles, including as Minister of Home Affairs and Minister of Defense. His unassuming demeanor and loyalty to Sata positioned him as a compromise candidate within the PF, which was rife with factionalism. In January 2015, Lungu narrowly won the presidential by-election against Hichilema, securing 48.3% of the vote. His victory was bolstered by the PF's strong base in urban areas and the Copperbelt, as well as Sata's lingering populist legacy. The Lungu family's influence grew during his presidency. Esther Lungu, as First Lady, played a visible role, engaging in charitable activities and public appearances that enhanced enhanced the family's public image. However, allegations of nepotism and favoritism began to surface, with critics pointing to the appointment of Lungu's relatives and allies to key positions. The Lungu family's political brand was built on a narrative of continuity from Sada's pro-poor policies, but it increasingly became associated with governance challenges, including economic mismanagement and democratic erosion. Consolidation of power. Lungu's presidency was marked by efforts to entrench his authority. The 2016 constitutional amendments, which allowed for a two-term limit clarification and expanded presidential powers, were seen as moves to consolidate his grip. The PF's control over state institutions, including the Judiciary and Electoral Commission, raised concerns about democratic backsliding. Lungu's administration faced accusations of suppressing opposition voices, with Hichilema's arrest in 2017 on charges of treason later dropped, being a flashpoint. Media freedoms were curtailed, and public protests were often met with heavy-handed responses. Economically, Lungu's tenure saw Zambia's debt balloon, driven by infrastructure projects financed through Chinese loans and Eurobonds. While projects like road construction and energy investments were touted as development achievements, they strained Zambia's fiscal position. By 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its Eurobond debt during the COVID-19 pandemic, exacerbating economic hardship. Public discontent grew as inflation soared, and the cost of living became unbearable for many. The Lungu family's influence extended beyond politics into business circles, with allegations of corruption and cronyism. Reports surfaced of questionable contracts awarded to PF-aligned businesses, and the Anti-Corruption Commission faced challenges in pursuing high-profile cases. Esther Lungu's foundation and other family ventures were scrutinized for potential misuse of public resources, though concrete evidence remained contentious. The fall. The 2021 election was a referendum on Lungu's leadership. Facing a united opposition under Hichilema's UPND, Lungu struggled to counter the narrative of economic failure and democratic decline. The UPND capitalized on youth discontent, high unemployment, and frustration with PF governance. Hichilema's victory, with 2.8 million votes to Lungu's 1.8 million, was decisive, reflecting a broad coalition of urban and rural voters. Post-election, Lungu initially hinted at challenging the results, but eventually conceded, a move that preserved Zambia's tradition of peaceful transitions. The Lungu family's political influence waned, with Esther Lungu and other relatives facing investigations by Hichilema's administration for alleged corruption. Edgar Lungu himself retreated from the public eye, but remained a symbolic figure for PF loyalists, raising questions about his potential return to politics. Legacy and implications. The Lungu family's saga reflects broader themes in Zambian politics, the interplay of populism, patronage, and economic challenges. Lungu's presidency highlighted the risks of centralized power and weak institutions, but it also underscored Zambia's democratic resilience as voters rejected the PF's grip on power. The family's fall has opened space for accountability, with Hichilema's government pursuing anti-corruption measures, though these efforts risk being perceived as politically motivated. The Lungu era's legacy will continue to shape Zambia's political discourse, particularly as the PF seeks to regroup ahead of future elections. Power shifts after Lungu's departure. The transition from Edgar Lungu to Hakainde Hichilema in August 2021 marked a significant power shift in Zambia, with implications for governance, policy, and political dynamics. This shift was not merely a change in leadership, but a reconfiguration of political alliances, institutional priorities, and public expectations. Below, I explore the dimensions of this power shift, including the reconfiguration of political coalitions, institutional reforms, and the challenges of consolidating power in a polarized society. Political coalitions and party dynamics. Hichilema's victory was underpinned by a broad coalition that included urban youth, rural voters, and disaffected PF supporters. The UPND, historically strong in southern, western, and northwestern provinces, expanded its reach into PF strongholds like the Copperbelt and Lusaka, driven by economic discontent and a desire for change. This coalition, however, is fragile as it unites diverse interests, business elites, rural farmers, and urban professionals whose priorities may diverge. The PF, meanwhile, faced internal disarray post-2021. Lungu's departure left a leadership vacuum, with factionalism undermining the party's ability to mount a cohesive opposition. Key figures like Given Labinda and Miles Sampa vied for control, while Lungu's influence lingered as a rallying point for loyalists. The power shift thus weakened the PF's dominance, but its regional strongholds and populist appeal suggest it remains a potent force. Institutional reforms. Hichilema's administration moved quickly to signal a break from Lungu's governance style. Key appointments, such as new leadership in the Anti-Corruption Commission and the Electoral Commission of Zambia, aimed to restore institutional credibility. The judiciary, perceived as compromised under Lungu, saw efforts to rebuild independence, though progress has been uneven. The repeal of restrictive laws, such as the Public Order Act, was promised to enhance civic space, but implementation has faced delays. The power shift also involved a reorientation of economic policy. Hichilema, a businessman with a pro-market outlook, prioritized debt restructuring and fiscal discipline. In 2022, Zambia secured a $1.2 $7.3 billion extended credit facility from the IMF, a milestone in addressing the debt crisis. However, austerity measures, including subsidy cuts, sparked public discontent, testing Hichilema's ability to balance reform with social stability. Regional and social dynamics. The power shift exposed regional tensions. The UPND's strongholds in the south and west contrast with PF support in the north and east, creating a polarized political map. Hichilema's appointments, perceived as favoring his base, have fueled accusations of tribalism, a sensitive issue in Zambia's multi-ethnic society. Bridging these divides is critical to consolidating power. Challenges to consolidation. Hichilema's ability to sustain this power shift depends on delivering tangible results. Economic recovery remains slow, with inflation and unemployment persisting as challenges. The UPND's anti-corruption drive, while popular, risks being seen as selective if it disproportionately targets PF figures. Moreover, the opposition, though weakened, could exploit public discontent, particularly if economic hardships persist. The power shift also has external ramifications. Hichilema has sought to balance relations with China, the West, and regional partners like South Africa. While Lungu leaned heavily on Chinese investment, Hichilema's pro-Western stance has attracted support from the US and EU, but risks alienating Beijing. Navigating these dynamics will shape Zambia's geopolitical positioning. In summary, the power shift post-Lungu represents a realignment of political, institutional, and economic priorities. Hichilema's challenge is to sustain the momentum of reform while managing a fractious political landscape and public expectations. President HH's challenges and opportunities. Hakainde Hichilema, Zambia's 7th president, assumed office with a mandate for change, but faces a complex array of challenges and opportunities. His administration's success hinges on addressing economic woes, restoring democratic norms, and navigating Zambia's geopolitical role. Below, I outline the key challenges and opportunities, providing a nuanced view of Hichilema's presidency. Challenges. Economic recovery. Zambia's economy is in a precarious state. The debt crisis, with external obligations exceeding $14 billion, limits fiscal space. The IMF deal and debt restructuring agreements with creditors like China and Eurobond holders are steps forward, but austerity measures such as fuel subsidy cuts have driven up living costs, sparking protests. Inflation, at 15% in 2022, and unemployment, particularly among youth, over 60% of the population, remain pressing issues. Hichilema must deliver growth without alienating his base. Political polarization. Zambia's regional and ethnic divides complicate governance. The UPND's dominance in southern and western provinces contrasts with PF support in the north and east. Appointments perceived as favoring Hichilema's Tonga ethnic group have fueled tensions, risking accusations of tribalism. Building a national coalition while maintaining his core support is a delicate balancing act. Anti-corruption campaign. Hichilema's pledge to tackle corruption is central to his agenda. Investigations into PF-era mismanagement, including cases involving the Lungu family, have gained traction. However, selective prosecution risks undermining credibility, and the slow pace of convictions frustrates the public. Strengthening institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission without politicizing them is a key challenge. Democratic backsliding concerns. While Hichilema campaigned on restoring democratic norms, critics point to continued restrictions on opposition activities and media. Ensuring free expression and fair elections in 2026 will be critical to maintaining legitimacy. External pressures. Zambia's reliance on foreign investment, particularly in mining, exposes it to global powers. Balancing relations with China, which holds significant debt, and Western partners who support Hichilema's reforms requires diplomatic finesse. Geopolitical tensions, such as US-China rivalry, could complicate Zambia's position. Opportunities. Economic diversification. Zambia's copper dependency offers an opportunity to diversify into agriculture, tourism, and renewable energy. Hichilema's business background positions him to attract investment, particularly from Western partners. Initiatives like the Lobito Corridor, connecting Zambia to Atlantic ports, could boost trade. Youth engagement. With a young population, Hichilema has a chance to harness demographic dividends through education and job creation. Policies targeting skills development and entrepreneurship could transform Zambia's economic landscape. Democratic renewal. Hichilema's commitment to institutional reform, including strengthening the judiciary and electoral processes, offers a chance to deepen Zambia's democracy. Transparent governance could rebuild public trust and attract donor support. Global partnerships. Hichilema's pro-market stance has won favor with Western governments and institutions like the IMF. Leveraging these partnerships for debt relief and investment could stabilize the economy and fund development projects. Regional leadership. As a stable democracy, Zambia can play a larger role in the Southern African Development Community (SADC). Hichilema's diplomatic engagement, such as hosting regional summits, could enhance Zambia's influence. Hichilema's presidency is a high-stakes endeavor. Success depends on balancing immediate economic relief with long-term reforms, fostering inclusivity, and navigating global pressures. Failure to deliver could embolden the opposition and erode public trust, jeopardizing the gains of 2020. 2021. The hidden influence of global powers. Zambia's strategic position, rich mineral resources, and debt dynamics make it a focal point for global powers, particularly China, the United States, and the European Union. The influence of these actors, often subtle but significant, shapes Zambia's economic and political trajectory. Below, I explore how global powers impact Zambia, focusing on their economic, geopolitical, and soft power strategies. China's role. China's influence in Zambia is profound, driven by its role as the country's largest creditor and investor. By 2020, Zambia owed China approximately $6.6 billion, primarily for infrastructure projects like roads, airports, and power plants. The Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) has deepened this relationship, with Chinese state-owned enterprises like China Non-Ferrous Metal Mining Corporation dominating Zambia's copper sector. However, this influence has sparked debate. Critics argue that Chinese loans, often opaque, have contributed to Zambia's debt crisis, with terms favoring Beijing. The 2020 debt default highlighted these tensions, as China resisted multilateral restructuring efforts led by the IMF. Hichilema's administration has sought to renegotiate these loans, but China's leverage remains significant, particularly in mining and infrastructure. Beyond economics, China wields soft power through cultural exchanges, scholarships, and media partnerships. The presence of Chinese businesses and workers in Zambia has also raised local concerns about labor practices and economic displacement, fueling anti-China sentiment in some quarters. Western influence. The United States and EU have ramped up engagement with Zambia under Hichilema, viewing it as a democratic success story and a counterweight to Chinese influence. The US has supported Zambia's IMF deal and debt restructuring, with initiatives like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment (PGII) aiming to rival the BRI. The EU, meanwhile, has funded renewable energy and agriculture projects, aligning with Hichilema's diversification goals. Western influence extends to governance. USAID and European donors have supported anti-corruption and electoral reforms, reinforcing Hichilema's agenda. However, this alignment risks perceptions of Zambia as a Western proxy, potentially alienating China and domestic critics wary of neo-colonialism. Geopolitical dynamics. Zambia's position in the US-China rivalry is delicate. The country's critical minerals, including copper and cobalt, are vital for green energy transitions, making it a prize for both powers. The US has pushed for transparency in mining contracts, while China seeks to maintain its dominance. Hichilema's balancing act involves securing Western investment without antagonizing Beijing, a task complicated by global tensions. Regional powers. South Africa and India also play roles. South Africa, a regional economic powerhouse, is a key trading partner, while India's growing investments in mining and pharmaceuticals add another layer of influence. These relationships offer Zambia opportunities to diversify partnerships, but also require careful navigation to avoid dependency. Implications. The hidden influence of global powers shapes Zambia's policy options. Hichilema must leverage these relationships to secure debt relief and investment while maintaining sovereignty. Public perceptions of foreign influence, particularly Chinese dominance, could fuel political tensions, especially if economic benefits are not broadly shared. Zambia's ability to assert its interests in this complex web will determine its global standing. Zambian public reaction to the change. The 2021 election and Hichilema's rise elicited a range of reactions from Zambians, reflecting hope, skepticism, and division. Public sentiment, shaped by economic hardship, political polarization, and regional dynamics, offers insight into the challenges and expectations facing the new administration. Hope and optimism. Hichilema's victory was met with jubilation among UPND supporters and those frustrated with Lungu's governance. Urban youth, who turned out in large numbers, saw Hichilema as a reformist who could address unemployment and economic stagnation. His promises of free education, anti-corruption measures, and job creation resonated with a population weary of PF mismanagement. The peaceful transition was celebrated as a democratic triumph, with 70% voter turnout signaling strong public engagement. Skepticism and discontent. However, not all Zambians embraced the change. PF strongholds, particularly in the Copperbelt and northern regions, expressed loyalty to Lungu, viewing Hichilema's victory as a loss of regional influence. Accusations of tribalism surfaced, with some claiming the UPND favored Tonga-dominated areas. Economic austerity, including subsidy cuts, led to protests in 2022, particularly among urban poor and civil servants facing rising costs. Regional and demographic variations. Public reaction varied by region and demographic. In UPND strongholds like Southern Province, support for Hichilema remained strong, with communities benefiting from infrastructure projects and agricultural support. In contrast, Copperbelt residents reliant on mining have voiced frustration over slow economic recovery. Youth, while initially enthusiastic, have grown impatient with the pace of job creation, with social media platforms amplifying these grievances. Civil society and media. Civil society has been cautiously optimistic, praising Hichilema's anti-corruption efforts but urging faster democratic reforms. The media, freed from some PF-era restrictions, has played a critical role in shaping public discourse, though though concerns about government pressure persist. Long-term sentiment. Public reaction will hinge on Hichilema's ability to deliver. Economic improvements such as debt restructuring and mining sector growth could sustain support, but failure to address poverty and unemployment risks disillusionment. The 2026 election will be a key test of public sentiment, with the PF seeking to capitalize on any missteps. What the future could hold for Zambia. Zambia's future depends on its ability to navigate economic, political, and social challenges while leveraging its resources and strategic position. Below, I outline potential scenarios for Zambia's trajectory, focusing on economic recovery, governance, and global positioning. Economic prospects. Zambia's copper wealth positions it to benefit from the global green energy transition, with demand for copper and cobalt rising. Successful debt restructuring could free resources for investment in agriculture, tourism, and renewable energy, reducing copper dependency. However, failure to diversify or manage debt could perpetuate economic instability, with inflation and unemployment undermining progress. Political stability. Hichilema's ability to bridge regional and ethnic divides will shape political stability. Inclusive governance and equitable resource allocation could strengthen national unity, while perceived favoritism risks unrest. The 2026 election will be pivotal, with a resurgent PF or new opposition forces challenging the UPND. Democratic consolidation. Strengthening institutions such as the Judiciary and Electoral Commission could deepen Zambia's democracy. Transparent anti-corruption measures and media freedom are critical to maintaining public trust. However, authoritarian tendencies or selective justice could erode democratic gains. Global role. Zambia's strategic minerals and stable democracy position it as a key player in regional and global affairs. Balancing relations with China, the West, and regional powers like South Africa could enhance its influence. The Lobito Corridor and other infrastructure projects offer opportunities for trade and investment. Social development. Investing in education, healthcare, and youth empowerment could harness Zambia's demographic dividend. Free education policies, if sustained, could improve literacy and skills, but funding constraints pose challenges. Addressing poverty, which affects over half the population, is critical to social stability. Scenarios. Optimistic scenario. Economic recovery, driven by mining and diversification, reduces poverty and unemployment. Hichilema consolidates power through inclusive governance, strengthening democracy. Zambia emerges as a regional leader, balancing global partnerships. Pessimistic scenario. Economic stagnation and austerity fuel unrest, deepening polarization. The PF, or a new opposition, exploits discontent, leading to political instability. Foreign influence undermines sovereignty. Middle path. Gradual economic recovery occurs, but challenges like unemployment persist. Hichilema maintains power, but faces opposition in 2026. Zambia balances global relations, but struggles with internal cohesion. Zambia's future hinges on leadership, institutional strength, and public engagement. While challenges abound, the country's resilience and resources offer hope for a brighter chapter. Closing thoughts. Zambia stands at a crossroads, with the potential to redefine its trajectory or repeat past cycles of promise and disappointment. The end of the Lungu era and Hichilema's rise represent a moment of opportunity, but success is not guaranteed. Economic recovery, democratic renewal, and inclusive governance are critical to fulfilling the aspirations of Zambians. Global powers will continue to shape Zambia's path, but the country's agency in navigating these relationships will determine its sovereignty and prosperity. The public's hope, tempered by skepticism, underscores the need for tangible results. Zambia's next chapter depends on its ability to learn from its past while embracing a future built on resilience, unity, and opportunity.